Hello, my name is William, and today I will be showing you how to use the repetitionless asset. So I won't be covering most of the features in depth, but I will show you the gist of how to set up the material with the terrain. I'm not going to show you the regular material, but I'll get to that later. Most of the stuff's basically the same anyway, except for the extra terrain setup that I'll show you here. So how to set up a terrain. First, we have our terrain set up with the regular terrainlet material. And what we want to do is go to the object and add a repetitionless terrain component. What the repetitionless terrain component will do is it will handle syncing the terrain layers to the material and passing the terrain textures to the material. That's basically it, except for some extra quality of life syncing stuff. Now, there are two ways you can set up a repetitionless terrain. You can either use a main material, which I'll be showing you now how to use, and you can either use a parent terrain, which is just another terrain, which I will show you how to use a bit later. So let's get started on the material. So we first need a material, which we can go to our project window and create a material as usual. And in the shader, we select repetitionless, and whichever render pipeline you're using, I'm using URP, and I will select the repetitionless terrain one because I'm using a terrain. Now, the basic material is pretty much the same, except it only has one layer and no terrain features, and you just assign it in the mesh render of any object. Now, once you create a material, it will also create a data folder alongside it. This folder will store the properties and texture arrays for the material. And this folder must always be next to the material, but if you move, rename, delete your material, it will automatically do that as well. So you don't need to worry about this unless you are copying the material. If you're copying the material, you also need to copy the data folder alongside it if you want to keep the properties and textures. Now, the textures in a material are stored in texture arrays, which is just used to pass less textures to the shader, basically. And they use packed versions of the textures that you assign for less samples in the shader. The downside to using texture arrays is there can only be one resolution for every texture in an array, but that's automatically handled. So when you assign a texture to the material inspector, it will, if it differs in resolution to the texture array, it will show you a pop-up with which resolution you want to use. If you want to use the array resolution or you want to use the new texture resolution, it'll just resize whichever one you want to change. And this is all automatically handled, the texture arrays and saving it. You don't need to worry about any of that. And you can also modify a texture array in the array settings here. So if I assign any texture here, it'll pack that and save it to the terrain layer here. So here the albedo is stored in the RGB. And in here you can see if I go to array settings, AV textures, which is the albedo and variation, you can configure the array in the configure window. So here you can basically change the texture format, the mid-maps, just all the settings and everything for it. And you can also resize the textures if you want, which you can go here and change the textures to whatever resolution you want. And once you've changed anything, you click recreate array and then it will change it in the material here. Now, once we have our material set up, we can go into the terrain and just drag it over into the material section. And what this is doing is it is getting all the terrain layers here and it's packing all the textures and then generating texture arrays for them. So here now you can see I've got texture arrays for each of the terrain layers. Now that we have our material set to terrain, you can see that it has added all the terrain layers to the inspector here, and you can see them all here, and you can change which one you're editing, which you can view here as well. And these terrain layers automatically take from the terrain, so you can't change them here, but if you go on the terrain and say change the first one to the rock texture, if you go back, it'll have the rock one here and the grass one will be on the second one, which I'll just change that back. Now, all the features in the material are all layer independent. So say you want to add distance blending or material blending to only one layer, or just change the noise for one, they are all specific to that layer. So if I add distance blending specifically for the grass, it hasn't changed it for the rock, and then I can go to the rock and change this to something different, like 1 by 1, but then see in the distance the Oh, the trees are popping in, but the grass one is different. Now, aside from that, the material properties and the debug properties are material for the whole material layer. So changing these will not be layer dependent. Now you also notice that the tiling is a little bit larger in the repetitionless terrain. That's because the UV space has changed. In the terrain they're using local UVs and now it's automatically set to world UVs. Now, pretty much all we have to do is just change the scale to something a bit larger. So I will change this to like 100 by 100. Put that back up on all of them. Now disable the distance blending. And then you can see it has, yeah, made the texture smaller, and now you can go down and they look nice and they're all good scaling. Now you also notice that it already has these, yeah, materials, textures assigned from the terrain layers, which you can just go in and have a look at here. And changing these properties will automatically update the terrain layer. So let me add another inspector so I can show you. Lock this one. So this muddy terrain layer, if I change the scale, you can see it changing in the terrain layer here as well. And say if I change the texture to like a grass one temporarily, it'll have the grass here and I can change that back. You can see how that's also updating in the terrain here as well. And then same goes for inner terrain layer. So if you change the scale of this, you will need to save, and then it will also automatically update the actual material. So if I go back there, now it'll be in the, this one is about 40. I'll just change that back. Now with the terrain layers in the terrain, these will automatically update and change the material whenever you change them here. So if you already saw before, but if I change the order of them, they'll change. If I add a like sand texture or something, and then I start drawing that on, that's automatically updated, and I can undo that, and I can also remove that. And then it's all automatically updated, all the textures are repacked and everything is handled for you. You can disable that if you like with the autosave textures button. You just click that, and now if you change it, it won't do it. It won't automatically update it, but you can click the save textures button and then it will automatically update it for you. So what the save textures button does is it is just a manual save which syncs the terrain layers, transfers the terrain control and holds textures to the material, and it reassigns the material in the terrain if it's not assigned. So if you're having any issues with the terrain, like the materials aren't, the textures aren't assigning properly, just click the save textures button. But if you do have any if you do have any issues that do not persist with that, feel free to contact me or put an issue in the GitHub page, which I'll just leave in the description. Why not make it easy? So the terrain layers are globally synced to the material, which basically just means you can only have one set of terrain layers for a material. And if you have two different terrains with the same material, but different terrain textures, it will basically just use the most recent one you've synced. So if you sync this one with these textures, the other terrain will also use these textures because it's on the same material. And to fix that, we use the parent terrain field here, which will just take all the terrain layers and the material from the terrain set here and just automatically change it in the parent terrain, which I will show you here. So this is another thing with neighboring terrains. If you create a neighboring one, it'll automatically assign a repetitionless terrain to it with the parent terrain set as the original one. And in here, you can see as well that the terrain layers are all automatically set up here. And if I go through here and just start drawing on some textures, they'll just work automatically and they'll be synced. And if you change or like update any textures here, they will also be updated in all the children terrain as well. So say you have multiple pre-made terrains and you've already set up one with the main material, this will be our main terrain, and we want to set up the rest of them with repetitionless. What you have to do is go to your other terrains, add a repetitionless terrain component, and then go through and assign the main terrain as the parent to each of them, which will automatically transfer the material and all terrain layers and everything over. Now, on top of the terrains, there are also sub-shaders that you can use to implement these features into your own materials. So if we go to create a shader graph, I'm using URP, so I'll make one here. And I go to the nodes, you can see there's a repetitionless section with the compression used for the variables, the distance blending, variation, the noise used, and then like if you have a noise, you assign a texture and automatically apply the noise that's applied to the things. And all these have a bunch of settings. So let me show you with the distance blending one. So from 100 to 150 meters, it will be a white color up close and a black color up far. So I will assign that and then create a material so I can show you how that works. In the terrain, if I go here and assign this here, you can see if I get close to the terrain, it'll start showing white. And all the sub shaders you can use them however you like. And if you prefer to use written code, you can go down to your packages, go to repetitionless, shaders, and in HLSL, these are all the written shaders that the shaders are using pretty much. And you can go through here and include these however you like. And there are also samples included in the asset, which you can import. I already have them here, so I will just delete this. And then I go to repetitionless, open window, and this is the same window that you see when you first import the package, but you can import the samples here, and it'll automatically take these samples from the samples folder. And then you see here we've got the 3 samples which are automatically imported for your render pipeline. If you want to manually import them, you can go to your package manager through either window package manager, or just package manager if you're older Unity version. And in project, if you scroll to the bottom, packages William Shirk, and then you can see here the repetitionless one. And then in the samples, you first need to import the core sample assets, and then whichever render pipeline you want here as well. And that's basically it for the asset. If you want written documentation on, say, the scripts, the shaders, or written tutorials, I'll leave the documentation link in the description, or it's also in the asset store page if you're watching from there. And thank you for considering or using my asset, and I hope you have a good one.